Alright, so hi, I'm Ender, the face behind the voice of Philosophy by Choice, and I'm going to try a different approach to recording videos and audio where it reduces a lot of the editing time that I end up getting involved in as I do these readings. So I'm going to give this a go, and yeah, we'll see. Alright, so we're on chapter 4 of Max Weber, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. It's called The Religious Foundations of Worldly Asceticism. I am going to skip through parts because this chapter is a bit outdated and it's kind of racist, and so I'll skip through different sections, and it's also pretty tedious at parts that aren't necessarily contributing to the main narrative of this piece of work by Max Weber. So here it goes. In history, there have been 4 principal forms of ascetic Protestantism, in the sense of word here used. Calvinism in the form which it assumed in the main area of its influence in Western Europe, especially in the 17th century, Pietism, Methodism, and 4, the sects growing out of the Baptist movement. None of these movements was completely separated from the others, and even the distinction from the non-ascetic churches of the Reformation is never perfectly clear. Methodism, which first arose in the middle of the 18th century within the established Church of England, was not in the minds of its founders intended to form a new church, but only a new awakening of the ascetic spirit within the old. Only in the course of its development, especially in its extension to America, did it become separate from the Anglican Church. It's curious. I wonder if he's saying that it became separated from, it became a non-religious lifestyle or movement that extended beyond kind of confines of its original religious culture. Pietism first split off from the Calvinistic movement in England, and especially in Holland. It remained loosely connected with orthodoxy, shading off from it by imperceptible gradations, until at the end of the 17th century it was absorbed into Lutheranism under Spener's leadership. Though the dogmatic adjustment was not entirely satisfactory, it remained a movement within the Lutheran Church. Only the faction dominated by Zinzendorf and affected by the lingering Hussite and Calvinistic influences within the Moravian Brotherhood was forced, like Methodism, against its will to form a peculiar sort of sect. Blah, 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 blah. I'm going to keep moving forward. It would almost seem as though we had best completely ignore both the dogmatic foundations and the ethical theory and confine our attention to the moral practice so far as it can be determined. That, however, is not true. The various different dogmatic roots of ascetic morality did no doubt die out after terrible struggles, but the original connection with those dogmas has left behind important traces in the later undogmatic ethics. Moreover, only the knowledge of the original body of ideas can help us to understand the connection of that morality with the idea of the afterlife, which absolutely dominated the most spiritual men of that time. Without its power overshadowing everything else, no moral awakening which seriously influenced practical life came into being in that period. We are naturally not concerned with the question of what was theoretically and officially taught in the ethical compendia of the time. However much practical significance this may have had through the influence of church discipline, pastoral work, and preaching, we are interested rather in something entirely different: the influence of those psychological sanctions which originated in religious belief and the practice of religion, gave a direction to practical conduct, and held the individual to it. Apologies for the suburban soundscape. We just need like a lawnmower or a leaf blower to contribute to whatever sort of power tool that is out there. You might not be able to hear it, but you can imagine it. Okay. Now, these sanctions were to a large extent derived from the peculiarities of the religious ideas behind them. The men of the day were occupied with abstract dogmas to an extent which itself can only be understood when we perceive the connections of these dogmas with practical religious interests. A few observations on dogma, which will seem to the non-theological reader as dull as they will hasty and superficial to the theologian, are indispensable. We can, of course, only proceed by presenting these religious ideas in the artificial simplicity of ideal types. Now, ideal types is kind of important within Max Weber's work as kind of how you talk about concepts and constructs, but they obviously differentiate in their actual manifestation. So I think that's kind of interesting from a sociological standpoint. Okay. For just because of the impossibility of drawing sharp boundaries in historical reality, we can only hope to understand their specific importance from an investigation of them in the most consistent and logical forms. So logical forms and ideal types are often paired together. All right, I'm going to skip over some of this because it's extremely detailed and quasi-racist. It's not quasi-racist, it is racist. Okay, this looks like a good spot to continue. Quite naturally, this attitude was impossible for his followers as early as Beza. For them, the certitudo salutis, in the sense of the recognizability of the state of grace, necessarily became of absolutely dominant importance. So, wherever the doctrine of predestination was held, the question could not be suppressed whether there were any infallible criteria by which membership in the electi could be known. Not only has this question continually had a central importance in the development of the Pietism which first arose on the basis of the Reformed Church, it has in fact, in a certain sense at times, been fundamental to it. But when we consider the great political and social importance of the Reformed doctrine and practice of the communion, we shall see how great a part was played during the whole 17th century outside of Pietism by the possibility of ascertaining the state of grace of the individual. On it depended, for instance, his admission to communion, i.e., to the central religious ceremony which determined the social standing of the participants. It was impossible, at least so far as the question of a man's own state of grace arose, to be satisfied with Calvin's trust in the testimony of the expectant faith resulting from grace, even though the orthodox doctrine had never formally abandoned that criterion. Above all, practical pastoral work, which had immediately to deal with all the suffering caused by the doctrine, could not be satisfied. It met these difficulties in various ways, so far as predestination was not reinterpreted, toned down, or fundamentally abandoned. Two principal, mutually connected types of pastoral advice appear. On the one hand, it is held to be an absolute duty to consider oneself chosen and to combat all doubts as temptations of the devil, since lack of self-confidence is the result of insufficient faith, hence of imperfect grace. To exhortation of the apostle to make fast one's own call is here interpreted as a duty to attain certainty of one's own election and justification in the daily struggle of life. In the place of humble sinners to whom Luther promises grace, if they trust themselves to God in penitent faith, or bred those self-confident saints whom we can rediscover in the hard Puritan merchants of the heroic age of capitalism, and isolated instances down to the present. On the other hand, in order to attain that self-confidence, intense worldly activity is recommended as the most suitable means. It, and it alone, disperses religious doubts and gives the certainty of grace. That worldly activity should be considered capable of this achievement, that it could, so to speak, be considered the most suitable means of counteracting feelings of religious anxiety, finds its explanation in the fundamental peculiarities of religious feelings in the Reformed Church, which come most clearly to light in its difference from Lutheranism in the doctrine of justification by faith. Okay, I'm going to skip forward. All right, so let's see. Thus, however useless good works might be as a means of attaining salvation, for even the elect remain beings of the flesh, and everything they do falls infinitely short of divine standards, nevertheless, they are indispensable as a sign of election.
All right, I'm hoping that this audio works. I'm inside of a kids' play facility. I'm not going to show you because it's insanity, but I don't know if you'll be able to hear me talking. All right, so where did we leave off before I got interrupted? They are the technical means not of purchasing salvation, but of getting rid of the fear of damnation. In this sense, they are occasionally referred to as directly necessary for salvation, or the postio salutis is made conditional on them. In practice, this means that God helps those who help themselves. Thus, the Calvinist, as it is sometimes put, himself creates his own salvation, or as would be more correct, the conviction of it. But this creation cannot, as in Catholicism, consist in a gradual accumulation of individual good works to one's credit, but rather in a systematic self control which at every moment stands before the inexorable alternative, chosen or damned. This brings us to the very important point in our investigation. It is common knowledge that Lutherans have again and again accused this line of thought, which was worked out in the Reformed churches and sects with increasing clarity, of reversion to the doctrine of salvation by works. And however justified the protests of the accused against identification of their dogmatic position with the Catholic doctrine, this accusation has surely been made with reason, if by it is meant the practical consequences for the everyday life of the average Christian of the Reformed Church. For a more intensive form of religious valuation of moral action than that to which Calvinism led its adherents has perhaps never existed. But what is important for the practical significance of this sort of salvation by works must be sought in a knowledge of the particular qualities which characterize their type of ethical conduct and distinguish it from everyday life of an average Christian in the Middle Ages. The difference may well be formulated as follows. The normal medieval Catholic layman lived ethically, so to speak, from hand to mouth. In the first place, he conscientiously fulfilled his traditional duties, but beyond that minimum, his good, his good works did not necessarily form a connected, or at least not a rationalized, system of life, but rather remained a succession of individual acts. He could use them on occasion demanded to atone for particular sins, to better his chances of salvation, or toward the end of his life as a sort of insurance premium. Of course, the Catholic ethic was an ethic of intentions, but the concrete intentio of a single act determines its value. I'm going to skip forward, blah, blah, blah. All right. Without doubt, Christian asceticism, both outwardly and in its inner meaning, contains many different things, but it has had a definitely rational character in its highest Occidental forms, as early as the Middle Ages, and in several forms even in antiquity. Okay. The great historical significance of Western monasticism, as contracted with that of the Orient, is based on this fact, not in all cases, but in its general type, in the rules of Saint Benedict, still more with the monks of Cluny, again with Cistercians, and most strongly the Jesuits. It has become emancipated from plainless otherworldliness and irrational self-torture. It had developed a systematic method of rational conduct with the purpose of overcoming the status naturae, to free man from the power of irrational impulses and his dependence on the world and on nature. I think that it here is Christian asceticism. Yeah, okay. It attempted to subject man to the supremacy of a purposeful will, to bring his actions under constant self control with a careful consideration of their ethical consequences. Thus, it trained the monk objectively as a worker in the service of the kingdom of God, and thereby further subjectively assured the salvation of his soul. This active self control, which formed the end of the exercia of St. Ignatius and of the rational monastic virtues everywhere, was also the most important practical ideal of Puritanism. And the deep contempt with which the cool reserve of its adherents is contrasted in the reports of the trials of its martyrs with the undisciplined blustering of the noble prelates and officials, can be seen that respect for quiet self-control, which still distinguishes the best type of English or American gentleman today, to put it in our terms, the Puritan, like every rational type of asceticism, tried to enable a man to maintain and act upon his constant motives, especially those which it taught him itself, against the emotions. In this formal psychological sense of the term, it tried to make him into a personality. Contrary to many popular ideas, the end of this asceticism was to be able to lead an alert, intelligent life. The most urgent task, the destruction of spontaneous, impulsive enjoyment, the most important means was to bring order into the conduct of its adherents. All these important points are emphasized in the rules of Catholic monasticism as strongly as in the principles of conduct of the Calvinist. On this methodical control over the whole of man rests the enormous expansive power of both, especially the ability of Calvinism, as against Lutheranism, to defend the cause of Protestantism as the church militant. Child is here. All right. Let's see, I kind of forgot where I was. On the other hand, the difference of the Calvinistic from the medieval asceticism is evident. It consisted in the disappearance of the Concilia Evangelica and the accompanying transformation of asceticism to activity within the world. It is not as though Catholicism had restricted the methodical life to monastic cells. This was, this was by no means the case either in theory or in practice. On the contrary, it has always been pointed out that, in spite of the greater ethical moderation of Catholicism, an ethically unsystematic life did not satisfy the highest ideals, which it had set up even for the life of the layman. The Tertiary Order of St. Francis was, for instance, a powerful attempt in the direction of an ascetic penetration of everyday life, and as we know, by no means the only one. We're going to skip forward, blah, 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 blah. But in the course of its development, Calvinism added something positive to this, the idea of the necessity of proving one's faith in worldly activity. Therein, it gave the broader groups of religiously inclined people a positive incentive to asceticism. By founding its ethics in the doctrine of predestination, it substituted for the spiritual aristocracy of monks outside of and above the world, the spiritual aristocracy of the predestined saints of God within the world. It was an aristocracy which, with its character indelibilis, was divided from the eternally damned remainder of humanity by a more impassable gulf, and its invisibility more terrifying gulf. Then separated the monk of the Middle Ages from the rest of the world. From the rest of the world about him, a gulf which penetrated all social relations. With its sharp brutality, this consciousness of divine grace of the elect and holy was accompanied by an attitude toward the sins of one's neighbors, not of sympathetic understanding based on consciousness of one's own weakness, but hatred and contempt for him as an enemy of God, bearing the signs of eternal damnation. This sort of feeling was capable of such intensity that it sometimes resulted in the formation of sects. This was the case when, as in the independent movement of the 17th century, the genuine Calvinist doctrine that the glory of God required the church to bring the damned under the law was outright by the conviction that it was outweighed by the conviction that it was an insult to God if an unren, un, unregenerate soul should be admitted to his house and partake in the sacraments, or even as a minister administer them. I'm going to skip forward. Okay. Sorry for my huge spider hands in the front here. Okay. As he observed his own conduct, the later Puritan also observed that of God and saw his finger in all the details of life. And contrary to this strict doctrine of Calvin, he usually knew why God took this or that measure. The process of sanctifying life could thus almost take on the character of a business enterprise. A thoroughgoing Christianization of the whole of life was a consequence of this methodical quality of ethical conduct into which Calvinism, as distinct from Lutheranism, forced men. That this rationality was decisive in its influence on practical life must always be borne in mind in order rightly to understand the influence of Calvinism. On the one hand, we can see that it took this element to exercise such an influence at all, but other faiths, as well as necessarily, had a similar influence when their ethical motives were the same in this decisive point, the doctrine of proof. I think he's winding up this chapter. Maybe not. Let's see. No. Okay. Um, he's going to talk about other religions that had a similar kind of rationalistic and um, production oriented or work oriented ethic. The combination of faith in absolutely valid norms with absolute determinism and the complete transcendentality of God was its way a product of great genius. At the same time, it was, in principle, very much more modern than the milder doctrine, making greater concessions to the feelings which subjected God to the moral law. Above all, we shall see again and again how fundamental is the idea of proof for our problem, since its practical significance as a psychological basis for rational morality could be studied in such purity in the doctrine of predestination. It was best to start where, wait, let me finish. It was best to start there with the doctrine in its most consistent form. Okay, I skipped forward again. This sanction, which conditions the ascetic character of religion, could doubtless in itself have been furnished by various different religious motives, as we will soon see. The Calvinistic doctrine of predestination was only one of several possibilities, but nevertheless, we have become convinced that in its way it had not only a quite unique consistency, but that its psychological effect was extraordinarily powerful. In comparison with it, the non-Calvinistic ascetic movements, considered purely from the point of view of the religious motivation of asceticism, form an attenuation of the inner consistency and power of Calvinism. But even in the actual historical development, the situation was, for the most part, such that the Calvinistic form of asceticism was either imitated by the other ascetic movements or used as a source of inspiration or of comparison in the development of their divergent principles, where, in spite of a different doctrinal basis, similar ascetic features have appeared. This has generally been the result of church organization. Of this we shall come to speak in another connection. Chapter 4, Section B, Pietism. Historically, the doctrine of predestination is also the starting point of the ascetic movement, usually known as Pietism. Insofar as the movement remained within the Reformed Church, it is almost impossible to draw the line between pietistic and non-pietistic Calvinists. Almost all the leading representatives of Puritanism are sometimes classed among the pietists. I'm going to skip a lot of history. Pietism with a deep distrust of the church, of the theologians. Pietistic groups wished by means of intensified asceticism to enjoy the blissfulness of community with God in this life. Just clicking forward. Extreme affectation by this emphasis. Just not really helpful. From our special point of view, at any rate, pietism meant simply the penetration of methodically controlled and supervised, thus of ascetic, conduct into the non Calvinistic denominations. But Lutheranism necessarily felt this rational asceticism to be a foreign element, and the lack of consistency in German pietistic doctrines was the result of the difficulties growing out of that fact. But again and again, insofar as the rational and ascetic elements of pietism outweigh the emotional, the ideas essential to our thesis maintained their place. There were 1. That the methodical development of one's own state of grace to a higher and higher degree of certainty and perfection in terms of the law was a sign of grace, and 2. That God's providence works through those in such a state of perfection, i.e., in that he gives them his signs if they wait patiently and deliberate methodically. Labor in a calling was also the ascetic activity par excellence for A. H. Frank, that God himself blessed his chosen ones through the success of their labors was as undeniable to him as we shall find it to have been to the Puritans. And as we substitute for the double decree, pietism worked out ideas which, in a way, essentially similar to Calvinism, though milder, established an aristocracy of the elect resting on God's especial grace, with all the psychological results pointed out above. Okay. All in all, when we consider German pietism from the point of view important for us, we must admit a vacillation and uncertainty in the religious basis of its asceticism, which makes it definitely weaker than an iron consistency of Calvinism, and which is partly the result of Lutheran influences and partly of its emotional character. To be sure, it is very one sided to make this emotional element the distinguishing characteristic of Pietism as opposed to Lutheranism. But compared to Calvinism, the rationalization of life was necessarily less intense because the pressure of occupation with a state of grace, which had continually to be proved, and which was concerned for the future in eternity, was diverted to the present emotional state, the place of the self confidence which the elect sought to attain and continually to renew in restless and successful work at his calling, was taken by an attitude of humility and abnegation. This, in turn, was partly the result of emotional stimulus directed solely toward the spiritual experience, partly of the Lutheran institution of the confession, which, though it was often looked upon with serious doubts by Pietism, was still generally tolerated. All this shows the influence of the peculiarly Lutheran conception of salvation by the forgiveness of sins and not by practical sanctification, in place of the systematic rational struggle to attain and retain certain knowledge of future otherworldly salvation, comes here the need to feel reconciliation and community with God now. One second. Thus, the tendency of the pursuit of present enjoyment to hinder the rational organization of economic life, depending as it does on provision for the future, has, in a certain sense, a parallel in the field of religious life. Evidently, then, the orientation of religious needs to present emotional satisfaction could not develop so powerful a motive to rationalize worldly activity as the need of the Calvinistic elect for proof with their exclusive preoccupation with the beyond. On the other hand, it was considerably more favorable to the methodical penetration of conduct with religion than the traditionalistic faith of the Orthodox Lutheran, bound as it was to the Word and the sacraments. We must again remind ourselves that this emotional pietism, of course, shades off into the way of life of the Puritan elect by quite gradual stages. If we can at least provisionally point out a practical consequence of the difference, we may say that the virtues favored by pietism here, more than those on the one hand of the faithful official, clerk, laborer, or domestic worker, and on the other of the predominantly patriarchal employer, with a pious condescension. Calvinism, in comparison, appears to be more closely related to the hard legalism and the active enterprise of the bourgeois capitalistic entrepreneurs. Finally, the purely emotional form of pietism is, as Ritschl has pointed out, a religious dilettantism for the leisure classes. However far this characterization falls short of being exhaustive, it helps to explain certain differences in the character, including the economic character, of peoples which have been under the influence of one or the other of these two ascetic movements. Methodism, Section C, Chapter 4. The combination of an emotional but still ascetic type of religion with increasing indifference to or repudiation of the dogmatic basis of Calvinistic asceticism is characteristic also of the Anglo-American movement corresponding to continental pietism, namely Methodism. The name in itself shows what impressed contemporaries what impressed contemporaries as characteristic of its adherents, the methodical, systematic nature of conduct for the purpose of attaining the certitudo salutis. This was from the beginning the center of religious aspiration for this movement, also, and remains so, in spite of all the differences, the undoubted relationship to certain branches of German pietism is shown above all by the fact that the method was used primarily to bring about the emotional act of conversion, and the emphasis on feeling in John Wesley, awakened by Moravian and Lutheran influences, led Methodism, which from the beginning saw its mission among the masses, to take on a strongly emotional character, especially in America. The attainment of repentance under certain circumstances involved an emotional struggle of such intensity as to lead to the most terrible ecstasies, which in America often took place in a public meeting. This formed the basis of a belief in the undeserved possession of divine grace, and at the same time of an immediate consciousness of justification and forgiveness. The song. Okay. Now, this emotional religion entered into a peculiar alliance, containing no small inherent difficulties with the ascetic ethics, which had for good and all been stamped with rationality by Puritanism. For one thing, unlike Calvinism, which held everything emotional to be illusory, the only sure basis for the certitudo salutis was in principle held to be a pure feeling of absolute certainty of forgiveness, derived immediately from the testimony of the Spirit, the coming of which could be definitely placed to the hour. Added to this is Wesley's doctrine of sanctification, which, though a decided departure from the orthodox doctrine, is a logical development of it. According to it, one reborn in this manner can, by virtue of the divine grace already working in him, even in this life, attain sanctification, the consciousness of perfection in the sense of freedom from sin, by a second, generally separate and often sudden spiritual transformation. However difficult of attainment this end is, generally not till toward the end of one's life, it must inevitably be sought, because it finally guarantees the certitudo salutis, and substitutes a serene confidence for the sullen worry of the Calvinists. And it distinguishes the true convert in his own eyes and thus of others by the fact that sin, at least, no longer has power over him. Blah, blah, blah. Skipping forward. Okay. Thus, from our viewpoint, the Methodist ethic appears to rest on a foundation of uncertainty, similar to Pietism, but the aspiration to the higher life, the second blessedness, served it as a sort of makeshift for the doctrine of predestination. Moreover, being English in origin, its ethical practice was closely related to that of English Puritanism, the revival of which is aspired to be. The emotional act of conversion was methodically induced, and after it was attained, there did not follow a pious enjoyment of community with God, after the manner of the emotional pietism of Zinzendorf, but the emotion, once awakened, was directed into a rational struggle for perfection. Hence, the emotional character of its faith did not lead to a spiritualization, a spiritualized religion of feeling like German pietism. It has already been shown by Schneckenberger that this fact was connected with the less intensive development of the sense of sin. Okay, and the next one's the Baptist sects. I'm going to skip through this. I think we're getting a little redundant. Quakers. Okay. But all Baptist communities desire to be pure churches in the sense of the blameless conduct of their members, a sincere repudiation of the world and its interests, and unconditional submission to God as speaking through the conscience were the only unchallengeable signs of true rebirth, and a corresponding type of conduct was thus indispensable to salvation. And hence the gift of God's grace could not be earned, but only one who followed the dictates of his conscience could be justified in considering himself reborn. Good works, in the sense, were a causa sine qua non. As we see, this last reasoning of Barclay, to whose exposition we have adhered, was again the equivalent in practice of the Calvinistic doctrine, and was certainly developed under the influence of the Calvinistic asceticism, which surrounded the Baptist sects in England and the Netherlands. George Fox devoted the whole of his early missionary activity to the preaching of its earnest and sincere adoption. But insofar as baptism affected the normal workday world, the idea that God only speaks when the flesh is silent evidently meant an incentive to the deliberate weighing of courses of action and their careful justification in terms of the individual conscience. The later Baptist communities, I said baptism, but insofar as, no, it was baptism. Okay. The later Baptist communities, most particularly the Quakers, adopted this quiet, moderate, eminently conscientious character of conduct. The radical elimination of magic from the world allowed no other psychological course than the practice of worldly asceticism. Since these communities would have nothing to do with the political powers and their doings, the external result also was the penetration of life in the calling with these ascetic virtues. The leaders of earliest Baptist movements were ruthlessly radical in their rejection of worldliness. But naturally, even in the first generation, the strictly apostolic way of life was not maintained as absolutely essential to the proof of rebirth for everyone. Well-to-do bourgeois there were, even in this generation and even before Menno, who definitely defended the practical worldly virtues and the system of private property. The strict morality of the Baptists had turned in practice into the path prepared by the Calvinistic ethic. This attitude meant a weakening of the Calvinistic conception of the calling, similar to those of Spener and the German Pietists. But on the other hand, the intensity of interest in economic occupation was considerably increased by various factors at work in the Baptist sects. In the first place, by the refusal to accept office in the service of the state, which originated as a religious duty following from a repudiation of everything worldly. After its abandonment in principle, it still remained, at least for the Mennonites and Quakers, effective in practice because the strict refusal to bear arms or to take oaths formed a sufficient disqualification for office. Hand in hand with it in all Baptist denominations went an invincible antagonism to any sort of aristocratic way of life. Partly, as with the Calvinists, it was a consequence of the prohibition of all idolatry of the flesh, partly a result of the aforementioned unpolitical or even anti political principles. The whole shrewd and conscientious rationality of Baptist conduct was thus forced into non political callings. This is like the longest chapter in the world. It's almost done. A further important element which promoted the intensity of the worldly asceticism of the Baptist denominations can in its full significance, also be considered only in another connection. Nevertheless, we may anticipate a few remarks on it to justify the order of presentation we have chosen. We have quite deliberately not taken as a starting point the objective social institutions of older Protestant churches and their ethical influences, especially not the more important church disciple, especially not the very important church discipline. We have preferred rather to take the results which subjective adoption of an ascetic faith might have had in the conduct of the individual. This way, not only This was not only because this side of the thing has previously received far less attention than the other, but also because the effect of the church discipline was by no means always a similar one. On the contrary, the ecclesiastical supervision of the life of the individual, which, as it was practiced in the Calvinistic state churches, almost amounted to an inquisition, might even retard the liberation of individual powers, which was conditioned by the rational ascetic pursuit of salvation, and in some cases actually did so. Okay. The mercantilistic regulations of the state might develop industries, but not, or certainly not alone, the spirit of capitalism. Where they assumed a despotic, authoritarian character, they to a large extent directly hindered it. Thus, a similar effect might well have resulted from ecclesiastical regimentation when it became excessively despotic. It enforced a particular type of external conformity, but in some cases weakened the subjective motives of rational conduct. Any discussion of this point must take account of the great difference between the results of the authoritarian moral discipline of the established churches and the corresponding discipline in the sects which rested on voluntary submission. That the Baptist movement everywhere and in principle founded sects and not churches was certainly as favorable to the intensity of their asceticism as was the case, to differing degrees, with those Calvinistic, Methodist, and Pietist communities which are driven by their situations into the formation of voluntary groups. It is our task to follow out the results of the Puritan idea of the calling in the business world now that the above sketch has attempted to show its religious foundations, with all the differences of detail and emphasis which these different ascetic movements show in the aspects with which they have been concerned. Much the same characteristics are present and important in all of them, but for our purposes, the decisive point was, to recapitulate, the conception of the state of religious grace, common to all the denominations, as the status which marks off its possessor from the degradation of the flesh from the world. On the other hand, though the means by which it was attained differed for different doctrines, It could not be guaranteed by any magical sacraments, by relief in the confession, nor by individual good works. That was only possible by proof in a specific type of conduct, unmistakably different from the way of life of the natural man. From that followed, for the individual, an incentive methodically to supervise his own state of grace in his own conduct, and thus to penetrate it with asceticism. But as we have seen, this ascetic conduct meant a rational planning of the whole of one's life in accordance with God's will. And this asceticism was no longer an opus superiogationis, 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 but something which could be required of everyone who would be certain of salvation. The religious life of the saints, as distinguished from the natural life, was the most important point. No longer lived outside the world in monastic no longer lived outside the world in monastic communities, but within the world as its institutions. This rationalization of conduct within this world, but for the sake of the world beyond, was the consequence of the concept of calling of ascetic Protestantism. Christian asceticism, at first fleeing from the world into solitude, had already ruled the world, which it had renounced from the monastery and through the church, but it had, on the whole, left the naturally spontaneous character of daily life in the world untouched. Now it strode into the marketplace of life, slammed the door of the monastery behind it, and undertook to penetrate just the daily routine of life with its methodicalness, to fashion it into a life in the world, but neither of nor for this world. With what results we shall try to make clear in the following discussion, which is Chapter 5, Asceticism and the Spirit of Capitalism.